Okay, that's an improvement. Hey there, folks. So before we get to the review proper, I have something that I need to say, and it's something that I'm going to continue to say for as long as I deem it to be necessary. The BBC, in particular the news arm of the BBC, is a transphobic organization that continually platforms transphobes, including recently a woman who called out for outright genocide against trans women, and they have yet to address the fact that they did that. So, screw them. And if you don't know what the hell I'm talking about, there's the link to a video where I explain it in detail. I'm not going to bog it down further in here, but I am going to point it out every time I talk about something BBC owned. And yes, I understand the difference between BBC News and the BBC Creative Department. Don't care. This is f***ed. That now having been said, War of the Sontarans. As I said in the cold open, this is better. This is actually a lot better. I'm not sure it's great. It's decent, and it definitely is sorting a lot of the problems I had last time. Not in the sense that it suddenly fixes or retroactively improves the issues that I had last time, but those issues are not repeating to the same degree. And in order to explain that, I need to put a little bit of context and also offer a slight mea culpa to some of my criticisms and critiques in the previous episode. Now, I did fail to remember that the division was something that was established back with The Timeless Child. The thing is, though, I haven't rewatched The Timeless Child. I don't have the energy to try and rewatch The Timeless Child. And I did not remember what the organization that the Fugitive Doctor was tied to introduced way back in Fugitive of the Jejune. Even though that's an episode I liked, I haven't rewatched Series 12 at all at this point. Other than Can You Hear Me? That's the only one I've seen more than once. So the fact that I did not remember that is partially on me. So me not realizing the way that I will never get his name right, so I'm still going to go with the dog alien. The way that the Doctor's pursuit of him ties into that story thread is there. I said it wasn't. It was because I did not remember that the division was the name of that. In my defense, unless you've rewatched Series 12 recently or are seriously invested in The Timeless Child, which I am not, then I think that's the kind of thing that previously on segments are built to remind you of, and it didn't. But even setting that aside, this has a structure to it that is basically what I said I wish the previous one had. One of the things I said about the Halloween Apocalypse was there was no central core that everything was built around. Technically, you could say that everything tied to the Flux, but that was just a logistical string. The Flux didn't feel like a central focus. It was a thing that was happening in addition to the skull-faced aliens, the Swarm and Azure, showing up, in addition to the dog alien, in addition to the Sontarans, in addition to Dan getting introduced, in addition to Vinder getting introduced. It was just one more thing on the pile, and while it was attempted to give it more weight by making it the threat, not anything really tied back to it in anything more than a very superficial way. And the way the story is structured, it was not given any more, or what was her name? Claire and the Weeping Angel. I'll reiterate, there was too much packed into that previous episode, and there really wasn't a clear central thing that everything else was working around. The closest thing it had was Dan and the dog alien, but we didn't know why any of that was happening. So all we had was questions, while more questions were being piled on by all the other stuff being introduced. Here, we have the Sontarans taking over Earth. That is the core, that is the central pillar around which everything else revolves, and it works so much better. I'm not saying you can't have multiple elements, but one of them, especially on a per-story basis, needs to be the primary one. I really do not feel that anything was clearly the primary thing that we were dealing with in the previous episode. Here, it definitely is. No question, Sontarans are the key thing. And actually, I was really enjoying this a lot up until about halfway point when the series villains, presumably Swarm and Azure, showed up, and because I find them actually incredibly generic, but you know what? Stick a pin in them. We'll come back to them. But the idea of the Sontarans in general using a temporal displacement to not only take over Earth, but basically take over Earth retroactively so that it's always been theirs is a nifty idea. I love that there is I love that the motivation is done as a reference to the very first appearance of the Sontarans, which is the Time Warrior, which is one of my favorite classic Doctor Who stories. And they reference Commander Lynx claiming the planet, which is one of the best moments from that episode. If you haven't seen it, he steps out of his little spaceship pod and just plants this flag. This one Sontaran, no fleet to back him up, he just shows up and goes, I claim this for the Sontaran Empire, and it's great. And I love the idea that they still believe that gives them a claim on the planet, and they're coming to simply make good on that. That is more than sufficient motivation, especially for a species like the Sontarans, as regimented and pig-headed as they are. That is spot on. Now, do we really get an explanation as to why they are the older style as opposed to the new one? No, but you know what? I think I kind of said previously it'd be nice to have an explanation. At this point, having sat with it a week, actually, no, we don't need it. And also, it makes the connection to Lynx stronger since this is the design more reminiscent of that very first appearance of the very first Sontaran character in the show. So I liked that already right off the bat. It's just relieving to see the Sontarans be something other than a background punchline. There are still comedic moments here, mostly to do with the Sontaran that was being healed and then released, some of the interactions there, but it's always made clear that they are a threat. Well, I say that. I think the Sontarans probably rivaled the Imperial Stormtroopers as the worst shots in the galaxy. When Dan was running away from a freaking little platoon of them, there were like, I don't know how many, there were like at least 4, it felt like 6, I don't know, I didn't count. But there's a bunch of them shooting at him, and he is not really dodging, he's not even running that fast, he's just kind of, and they can't hit him. Really? And then later, when Dan and the dog alien are on their ship and they open a door and the Sontarans are there and start shooting at them, you're like, you're 3 feet away and you're missing. Ay, ay, ay. That I don't love, because that's a very standard contrivance in basically any story that has heroes and the enemies have guns. They're always going to miss, but like, this felt like it drew attention to how bad of shots they were. Like, I didn't love that. I did think it was interesting that for setting it in the Crimean War, and around the same time as Florence Nightingale, who gets a name drop, they focused on Mary Seacole, who was someone who I had not heard of, and I kind of like that they picked a setting that I had heard of, referenced a historical figure that I had heard of, but presented me with a historical figure who I didn't know. Now, given my normal attitude towards the let's have a famous person from history show up stories, this is actually a decent way to thread the needle and avoid the issues that I tend to have, which is that they tend to be just very over-aggrandizing of these, great figures of history, whereas Mary Seacole comes across as much more human. I mean, a little idealized? Yeah, probably. But it didn't feel like I got a massive Wikipedia dump about her. We got a couple of details of information about her, enough for me to go, oh, okay. And then to, on my own time, look up more about her and go, oh, okay, that she was an interesting person. Cool. I kind of like that idea that instead of giving me a famous figure that I already know a ton about, like Winston Churchill or Queen Victoria or what have you, or giving me someone who maybe I know some about, but then vomiting a Wikipedia entry at me, like with whatever king it was in the Witch Hunters. I'm not going to bother to look it up. I don't care. But rather than doing those, giving me someone who you give me just enough information that if I want to find out more, you gave me enough information to be able to look them up and find out what I want on my own time. That's much better balanced than Doctor Who often does, and in particular has been under the Chibnall era. So decently done there. Now, I had set aside Swarm and Azure. Here's the problem with them for me right now is that they are very, very generic. They are very, you cannot stop me, I am in control style villains, which is not my favorite kind of villain in the first place, personally speaking, just personal preference. But in addition to that, given that Doctor Who has a very lengthy history of villains with that template of a personality, I don't know. I'm gonna spend a decent chunk of my time until I spot something that solidifies it, wondering why this couldn't have been existing villains, why this couldn't have been tied to Omega, Sutek, the Master, heck, the Great Intelligence, even. The general personality is not so far distinct from those others. Heck, they're honestly reminding me a lot of the godlike beings from Can You Hear Me? And I know most people don't like Can You Hear Me? I know I'm in a minority on that, but like, Chris, Mr. Chibnall, you've introduced characters that are like this already, and you're introducing more that fit the same mold. Now, there may be a reason, most likely a logistical narrative reason, why it had to be new ones, and there's something about them that pre-existing characters wouldn't have worked in. Maybe. I'll be keeping an eye out for whether or not that's the case. If it never manifests, I'm gonna count that as a fault. Because look, there's nothing wrong with introducing new villains. There is a problem with introducing new villains who fit a template that existing villains could have filled just as well with no detriment to the story. Will there be detriment to the story? I don't know. I need to find out more about them before I get any of that down. I'm strongly suspecting at this point that the planet time and I can never Chibnall, I can never remember the names of any of the species you come up with, but whatever the heck they were called is somehow going to be tied into the Doctor as the timeless child thing. That's my presumption at this point. We'll see. Now, here's the thing. As much as I enjoyed this episode, certainly a heck of a lot more than the previous one, and while not without my issues, most of those tying to the overall thing, and less so with the episode in and of itself. Honestly, if this had been a completely standalone Sontaran story without the ties to the Greater Flux thing, I probably would have liked it a lot. I love that the Sontaran commander picked the time period because he wanted to ride a horse. Like, that's a gorgeous detail. I love it. I also buy it. But it's a quirk. We've got quirks. Don't overload somebody with quirks, but I like that. But the thing is that right now, structurally, for something being sold as a quote unquote serialized story, what we've gotten so far is an episode that was overstuffed with nothing but setup and had no central story to speak of, followed by something that had a very clear central story, but a central story that could have been standalone to no particular detriment. So the sense that I'm getting at this point as to how Chibnall is approaching this as a serialized story is to have the Flux be the mechanism that connects various more or less standalone stories, which kind of puts it in mind, not dissimilar to, say, The Key to Time back in the Tom Baker era. I would say there's a bit more connective tissue to this than there is to The Key to Time. That is legitimately just an excuse to connect a bunch of otherwise completely unconnected stories. So, don't get me wrong, it's more connected than that. But if what we saw this episode is what is going to become standard for the series, it's not bad, but serialized feels honestly kind of like overselling it. Because this isn't really about 80% of this you could watch without knowing what's going on the rest of the series and get some enjoyment out of it. I'm not sure I'd call that serialized. Not entirely, at any rate. I suppose it's a little bit more connected than episodic, but not by much. It's dwelling right now on an odd middle space. And I'm kind of going to deal with this a little bit later on this month. I actually want to do a video sort of breaking down the positives and negatives of episodic versus serialized storytelling and the distinctions between them, besides, the obvious textbook definitions. It's not going to be strictly about Doctor Who, although clearly Doctor Who will be the reason I've been thinking about this stuff. But I wish, and here's the thing. Maybe this is partially on me because I was avoiding a lot of the pre-release news. I don't know if Chibnall talked in interviews or anything like that and said exactly how this was going to be structured and put together. So it is possible that maybe he said somewhere along the line, there's going to be a connecting story, but many of the episodes will be more or less standalone. Maybe he said that. I wasn't looking it up. I generally don't look up a ton of that kind of stuff about things in advance, mainly in the interest of trying to avoid spoilers. So I have a tendency to take in trailers and as little else as I can get away with, unless it's something so big that I can't ignore it. So I don't know if he said anything like that, but whether or not he did or he didn't, as a viewer, I'm coming at this kind of feeling like, I wonder if I would be having a better overall viewing experience if I'd had a clearer idea of exactly how this thing is going to be structured so that I had a better idea of what to expect. Because what I feel like I was told going in was serialized. And as serialized storytelling, a lot of people last episode seemed to use it as an excuse for why the episode didn't have to make sense because it was only part of a complete story, except it was released as a standalone episode. It has to do something, and the main issue I had with it was it lacked that clear central story to base everything else around, or at least I certainly feel that it did. But then it goes into this, which is closer to episodic with continuous elements, but I wouldn't call this serialized from the previous episode. So now I'm not entirely sure what this overall thing is. Like I said, it seems to be in this weird middle ground, and maybe it'll work out, but I kind of wish I'd known that going in. But again, maybe that's on me. Maybe they said and I wasn't paying attention. It's an improvement. In any case, regardless, this is an improvement over the previous one. I'm not going to say that necessarily improves my expectations for the next episode because, well, a couple of reasons. We've had the dog alien, it appears, at least for the time being, depart the story until later. I liked him, so I'm like, and it looks like we're going to get more focus on Swarm and Azure, which, hopefully means they'll become more interesting to me. But given how generic they feel, I don't have a ton of hope for that. So I'm not looking forward to something that's going to focus more on them and who they are. I mean, I'm curious in a strictly, I guess I might as well know what's going on sense, but not super curious in a, I must know the answer kind of way. But that's where I am right now. It's definitely better than the last one. And you know what? For right now, I'll take it. War of the Sontarans. What'd you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. I have a Patreon. That is how I pay my bills, keep this whole operation up and running. And any amount you're able to give there is of great assistance. There's also YouTube memberships if you want to go that way as well, but no big pressure on that. Because at the end of the day, my friends, you are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And look at you, sticking around through the credits. I appreciate that. Well, you know what? You're about to be treated to a whole ton of names going by on the screen, but there's a few of them that I want to give special attention to. My special thanks to Bookworm, Jared Boyce, MJ, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Kaylin Schwartz, Edelin, Hannah Acker, Robin Moore, Ross Schultz, and Shay Lagurle. If you want to hear me mispronounce your name, check out the reward tiers on the Patreon. But for right now, thanks so much.